That very word, Inquisition, it conjures up a grim image. For centuries, the various Inquisitions, medieval, Spanish, Roman, Portuguese, sought to root out heresy and unbelief, with methods that struck terror across Europe and its colonies. Yet even in those dark times, there were individuals and communities who dared to question the Inquisition's power. Their acts of resistance, whether through words, deeds, or even armed revolt, often came at a terrible cost. But still, these defiant souls, from outspoken peasants and learned scholars to rebellious princes and the common folk, left their own mark on history. So that is the question. What happened when people stood up to the Inquisition? Fortunately, we have a panorama of historical episodes spanning from medieval France all the way to colonial Mexico, in which courageous dissenters confronted the inquisitors. We'll see saints and heretics, scientists, mystics, nobles, and beggars, all testing the limits of conscience against the institution that claimed divine sanction. And through their stories, some tragic, some triumphant, I think we can gain a deeper understanding of how resistance to the Inquisition helped shape the course of a religious and intellectual freedom. And so, with all that being said, let's go back, journey through the burnings, the trials, the whispered prayers and shouted rebellions. It's a history of defiance in the face of persecution. Well, let me welcome you to the channel first, because that's always good manners, isn't it? If you are new here, or if you're yet to click the subscribe button, well, I invite you to do so. And thank you to those who are supporting on the Patreon and the YouTube memberships and those who checked out the merch store. The reason that you enjoy this entire video completely ad-free is because of their generous contributions. So consider becoming a member if you feel inclined to. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get on to our topic for today then. Nice and relaxed. And so we begin where the Inquisition begins, and that is in the 13th century. The medieval Inquisition was the papacy's response to popular heresies. In Languedoc, the southern region of France, the Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, had won many adherents of their own with their dualistic Christian teachings. Well, the church's eyebrows were certainly raised, and the answer was ferocious. It came in the form of a crusade launched in 1209, and soon after, inquisitors were dispatched to interrogate and convert, or, worst comes to worst, condemn any remaining Cathars. Of course, many of the Cathars yielded under the threat of fire, but some stood up to the inquisitors with unflinching faith. At the remote redoubt of Montsegur in 1244, over 200 Cathars chose death over recantation. They marched voluntarily onto a colossal bonfire after months of siege, choosing to do this rather than renounce their beliefs. This mass martyrdom demonstrated a form of resistance by endurance. The Cathars' steadfast refusal to surrender their creed, even when faced with certain death, was a powerful statement of spiritual defiance. But not all resistance was so passive. In medieval Germany, the papal inquisitor Conrad von Marburg became infamous for his ruthless zeal. Appointed to hunt heretics in the 1230s, Conrad spared no one. Legend says that he even condemned a noble simply for alleged satanic orgies. I don't know how they found evidence for that, but I suppose it doesn't really matter. Well, what we do know is his overreach provoked fierce anger among the local nobility. When Conrad accused the influential Count Sayn without solid proof, the backlash was swift. German bishops hesitated to convict the Count, so Conrad stormed off, only to be ambushed on the road. In 1233, a band of knights attacked and murdered Conrad von Marburg, hacking him to death alongside his assistant. This was a literal blow against the Inquisition's authority. Noblemen who felt wrong, taking justice into their own hands. As for Pope Gregory IX, he was outraged. He called Conrad a martyr for the faith and demanded his killers be punished. But nothing was going to bring Conrad back from the grave, punishment or not. As for the Germans, many of them breathed a sigh of relief. Conrad's terrifying campaign was finally over. The demise even tarnished the Inquisition's reputation locally. Contemporaries noted that the memory of Conrad's excesses, quote, turned opinion against the Inquisition for many years in German lands. In this instance, violence answered violence. The persecutor paid with his life when the accuser fought back. And around the same time period in northern Italy, an outlaw religious sect took arms in open rebellion. Fra Dolcino, a radical preacher, led the Apostolic Brethren, a movement preaching apostolic poverty and spiritual freedom. Branded heretics by the church, Dolcino and his followers retreated to the hills and defended themselves against the crusades for many, many years. They issued defiant letters denouncing the corrupt clergy and refused to surrender. Ultimately, starvation and winter broke their resistance. In 1307, Fra Dolcino was captured and condemned. He endured a horrific execution, a day-long public torture, ending in the burning at the stake. His rebellion was crushed utterly, but his very existence showed that the Inquisition could be met with armed resistance. Unfortunately, they had to make an example of him, I suppose. The friar's fate was so notable that Dante Alighieri, writing his Divine Comedy around that time, put a warning in the mouth of a damned soul for Fra Dolcino to, quote, supply himself with food, lest hunger undo him in the siege. In other words, Dolcino's defiance had entered legend. Though brutally suppressed, the uprising exposed deep social tensions, a sign that some would rather go down fighting than submit to what they saw was unjust. One of the most striking examples of people standing up to the Inquisition, in the Middle Ages at least, is the story of Bernard Délicieux, a Franciscan friar in Languedoc. Around 1299, Délicieux witnessed how the Inquisitor's agents in south of France were abusing their power, locking people up randomly on flimsy accusations, and then extorting and terrifying the populace in the aftermath of the Albigensian Crusade. But Bernard would not stay silent. This courageous friar became an agitator against the Inquisitors. While serving as prior of the Franciscan convent in Carcassonne, Délicieux led a revolt to protect two men accused of heresy, who had sought sanctuary in his monastery. He rallied the townsfolk to prevent the Inquisitors from arresting these alleged Cathars. In essence, a Franciscan, one of the Church's own, dared to obstruct the operations of the Dominican-led Inquisition, a bold act that could easily be deemed heresy in and of itself. But that wasn't the end of the story for Bernard. He didn't stop there. In 1300, he publicly denounced the local inquisitors' records as fraudulent, claiming they invented accusations with, quote, non-existent informants to justify arrests. His vocal criticism was so effective that the inquisitors fled Carcassonne temporarily in fear. And just imagine that scene, I suppose. The dreaded inquisitors, accustomed to instilling fear, were themselves driven out by an enraged community, led by a fearless leader. Well, of course, this was rather emboldening, so Délicieux took his case to the higher authorities. In 1301, he travelled to appeal directly to the King of France, that's Philip IV or Philip the Fair. There, alongside a royal official ally, Délicieux laid out how the Inquisitor of Carcassonne and even the local bishop were corrupt and tyrannical, abusing their power and endangering loyalty to the French kingdom. It was a pretty savvy argument that the Inquisition's overzealousness was a threat to public order and the Crown's authority, and it certainly struck a chord with the king. King Philip, who often clashed with church power himself, took the complaints very seriously. The offending inquisitor was removed from his post, and the scandalous bishop fined and stripped of secular authority. For the first time, a secular monarch decisively sided with an anti-Inquisition campaign. Bernard Délicieux succeeded, albeit briefly, in crippling the Inquisition's operations in Languedoc by enlisting royal intervention. However, the triumph had its limits. The Inquisition was down, but not out. By 1303, the Inquisitors attempted to reassert themselves, and Délicieux once again stirred up the populace. When a secret agreement emerged suggesting that all residents of Carcassonne had been considered relapsed heretics liable to burning, Délicieux preached a fiery sermon exposing this injustice. The result was an open riot. Townsfolk, inflamed by his words, rioted in Carcassonne. The royal viceroy had to step in with troops on Délicieux's side, transferring prisoners from the Inquisition's dungeons to the king's jail to reduce tensions. It was an extraordinary scenario. A local uprising essentially forced the authorities to take custody away from the Inquisition, explicitly acknowledging the people's distrust of the Inquisitors' prisons. Such was the power of Bernard Délicieux's advocacy. But in the end, the friars' crusade against the Inquisition met a tragic fate. The wheels of high justice turned against him once the Pope and conservative forces caught up. In 1317, Bernard Délicieux was arrested by order of Pope John XXII. After enduring torture, he was put on trial by inquisitors, including the famous Bernard Guy, and charged with a litany of offenses from treason to obstructing the Inquisition. Even the church that Délicieux served could not tolerate his brand of internal dissent. He ultimately confessed, under torture of course, to impeding the holy office, and was sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement. Chained in a tiny cell on a diet of bread and water, the once fired-up friar died in 1320, broken by the institution that he had defied. Bernard Délicieux's story is a pretty good example of how standing up to the Inquisition could yield short-term gains and inspire popular support. Yet also how formidable the Inquisition was in punishing its challengers. He managed to shake the Inquisition's hold on a region for a few years, a remarkable achievement, but he paid for this with his life. In hindsight, Délicieux is sometimes hailed as a medieval champion of justice, a rare voice who spoke truth to power in an age of repression. His rebellion shows both the possibility and peril of resistance. Even a humble friar, armed with enough moral courage, could rally an entire community against tyranny. Yet ultimately, the entrenched powers of Church and Pope crushed the revolt. While some medieval resistors fought or rioted, others engaged in moral and intellectual resistance during their trials. The inquisitorial courtroom itself could become a stage for brave dissent. As famous early example, of course, is Joan of Arc, not tried by the Spanish or Papal Inquisition per se, but by an English-backed church court for heresy in 1431. Joan, a teenage peasant who led French armies and claimed divine guidance, found herself interrogated for her unusual claims of faith. When a panel of theologians asked if she was in God's grace, a trick question, a yes would be heresy, a no would be self-condemnation, Joan gave a pretty good answer. She said, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Now this clever reply astonished the judges. One recorded that they were stupefied by her words. In that moment, this illiterate farm girl outwitted the learned inquisitors. Refusing to be caught up in this doctrinal trap. Joan's trial transcripts preserve many such bold exchanges. Under immense pressure, deprived of counsel, she mostly held firm to her visions, although she did momentarily sign an abjuration out of fear of execution. She quickly reasserted that her voices were true. Ultimately, Joan of Arc was condemned and burned at the stake. Killed but not conquered rather, to borrow Montaigne's phrase. Indeed, a generation later, the Church overturned her verdict and declared her a martyr. But her courageous testimony shows that even in an inquisitional trial, utterly stacked against the accused, the human spirit could shine through. Her voice, resolute, shrewd, and faithful, still echoes as an example of standing one's ground to the very end. Another pre-Reformation dissident who stood up during his trial was Jan Hus of Bohemia, an early church reformer influenced by Wycliffe's ideas. Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1415 to answer for charges of heresy. Despite a promise of safe conduct, he was arrested and trialed by church authorities. Well, not exactly the Inquisition, but a similar process against heresy. But Hus refused to renounce his criticisms of ecclesiastical corruption and the sale of indulgences. He declared he would not betray the truth that he understood from Scripture. And as the trial progressed, Hus could see that his fate was well and truly sealed. Yet he persisted in defending his conscience. In July of 1415, he was burned alive, dying while singing hymns. But Hus's story did not end in silence. His execution sparked outrage among his followers, leading to the Hussite Wars in Bohemia. For years, the Hussite rebels, composed of commoners and nobles loyal to his memory, fended off successive crusades sent by the Church and Empire. Armed with novel tactics and religious fervor, these Bohemians essentially made war on the inquisitorial impulse to stamp out their beliefs. They succeeded, to the extent that a compromise was reached The Church allowed the Hussites to have a form of tolerated worship, communion in both kinds, in 1436. Thus Husser's stance at Constance, although it cost him his life, ignited a popular resistance that actually forced the medieval church to negotiate and grant concessions. It's a pretty striking case, where collective defiance of inquisitorial persecution led to a measure of religious freedom, a precursor to later reformations. But of course, I'm sure you've heard of Jan Hus and Joan of Arc. But not all who defied the Inquisition were famous leaders. Some were ordinary folk whose names barely survive. The Inquisitors' registers from villages sometimes reveal humble individuals. One such figure was Domenico Scandella, known as Menocchio, a 16th century miller from Friuli in Italy. He was tried by the Roman Inquisition for his bizarre but thoughtful religious ideas formed in wide reading. During his trial, Menocchio argued theology with his interrogators unflinchingly. He told them that many church teachings were merely human inventions designed to exploit people. He even dared to say, quote, "The only sin was to harm one's neighbor." Blasphemy, he insisted, didn't truly hurt anyone except for the blasphemer. He dismissed the church's authority, claiming the clergy make their living by selling sacraments and indulgences. At one point, Menocchio burst out to the priests judging him, saying, quote, "You want to know more than God. You are like the devil. The more one thinks he knows, the less he knows." Well, as you can imagine, the Inquisitors did not like that little comment. A little bit too cheeky for them. Such audacious words in an inquisitorial trial were almost unheard of for some random peasant. After all, they were meant to be scared, shaking, frightened. But Menocchio effectively stood up to the Inquisition with ideas and words, articulating a proto-radical critique of the Church. Unfortunately, the outcome was quite grim. Initially, he was given a lenient sentence in the 1580s, perhaps because he recounted some of his opinions. But he just could not keep quiet. He relapsed into heretical talk, and he was right back there in the trial room. In 1599, he was declared an obstinate heresiarch and was executed by burning. His fate illustrates the pattern of many ordinary dissenters: a brave stand, followed by punishment. Yet thanks to detailed court records that survived, Menocchio's spirited defense of his personal cosmology has come down to us, allowing us to marvel at this miller who was debating with monks. His story, although it ends in ashes, helps enrich our understanding of her common people's resistance. Not only princes and theologians, but even millers in remote villages could question and resist, albeit at the ultimate cost. Okay, well, we're finally here at the Spanish Inquisition, and when we turn to them, starting in 1478, by the way, the center of gravity somewhat shifts. Here was an Inquisition under royal authority. The Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella and their successors. They grew notorious for targeting conversos, that is, Jewish or Muslim converts to Christianity suspected of secret apostasy, and later Protestants and other dissenters. The Spanish Inquisition operated with formidable powers across Spain and its empire. Even so, from its very inception, were those who stood up against it. Opposition began at the highest levels of society. In the Kingdom of Aragon, many elites were of Jewish Converso lineage, or at least sympathetic to them, and they resented the encroachment of the new Inquisition, which was actually seen as a Castilian import. This discontent turned violent in 1485 with the assassination of Pedro de Arbues, the Inquisitor of Aragon. Arbues was attacked while praying in the Cathedral of Zaragoza, struck down by a group of Converso conspirators seeking revenge for the Inquisition's persecutions. Mortally wounded by multiple stabs, Arbues died of his injuries. The assassination of an inquisitor was a shocking event. It showed that some Conversos, pushed to desperation, were willing to strike back. However, the aftermath, I'm sure you've already imagined, was quite brutal. The Inquisition used the murder as a justification to intensify the repression in Aragon. Dozens of Converso prominent citizens were rounded up, tortured, and executed for their supposed complicity in the crime. In essence, the resistance in this case provoked a harsher crackdown. The Crown and Inquisition made an example of the plotters. Arbues was later canonized as a saintly martyr, and the Converso community of Aragon was decimated. This pattern, an act of defiance followed by ruthless retribution, recurred in the Spanish Inquisition's history. It sends a clear message. Killing an inquisitor was not killing the Inquisition. Instead, it was just going to make them even more fanatical. Nonetheless, the very fact that high-placed Conversos dared mount a conspiracy reveals the intense hatred the Inquisition had sown. It was not accepted meekly by all. From its beginning, it faced underground resistance, and also resentment. But common people, too, engaged in subtler forms of resistance. In villages, neighbors sometimes warned secret Jews or Protestants to flee when the inquisitors were coming. There were instances of peasants helping suspects escape or refusing to inform on friends, despite the threat of torture. To stand silent under torture was perhaps the most heroic stance an accused person could take, effectively resisting by refusing to implicate others. For example, during the trials of the clandestine Protestants in Seville and Valladolid in the 1550s, a few brave souls like Julian Hernandez, a Bible smuggler, never betrayed his networks. He went to the stake, steadfast, clinging to his faith. Several Protestant women in Seville, accused of Lutheran heresy, likewise declined to recant. One, Maria de Boarquez, only in her early 20s, reportedly declared that she would gladly die for God's truth, and proceeded to the stake singing psalm verses. Such conduct, singing hymns on the way to execution, was noted with astonishment by onlookers. It was a direct affront to the Inquisition's purpose. These victims refused to give the Inquisition the satisfaction of public penitence. Instead, they turned their executions into moments of triumph in faith, as if a martyrdom rather than a punishment. While the Inquisition succeeded in silencing those individuals in flesh, it could not prevent the powerful impression such courage made on witnesses and later readers of these accounts. Interestingly, opposition to the Spanish Inquisition also emerged from within the political establishment as time went on. In the late 16th century, King Philip II attempted to use the Inquisition for political ends in Aragon against his enemy, Antonio Perez, a move that backfired spectacularly. Perez, a former royal secretary, had fled to Aragon where local law protected him. Philip induced the Inquisition to charge Perez with heresy, pretty convenient pretext to bypass Aragonese courts. The Aragonese, fiercely proud of their religious liberties, saw this as a royal affront, and rose in revolt in 1591, with mobs in Zaragoza shouting against the Inquisition's interference. They even broke into the Inquisition's jail and freed Perez. Though the revolt was suppressed by Philip's troops, it demonstrated that even devout Catholics in Aragon could turn against the Inquisition when it threatened their rights. And beyond Spain's borders, the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, 1560s to 70s, was fueled in part by hatred of the Inquisition. The Protestant Dutch called Philip II the new Nebuchadnezzar and decried the Inquisition's bloodshed. Dutch propaganda tales, some exaggerated, about Inquisition tortures galvanized public opinion. In 1556, a league of Dutch nobles petitioned the regent to suspend the Inquisition, arguing for relief from religious persecution. Although this started as a polite request, it became somewhat of a revolution. When Spanish armies under the Duke of Alva instituted a blood council, executing hundreds of Dutch Protestants, sort of martial law inquisition, I suppose, the Dutch resistance only hardened. Prince William of Orange, in his 1581 apology, enumerated the Inquisition's cruelties to justify Dutch independence, asserting that no people could tolerate such tyranny. In this case, standing up to the Inquisition took the form of a national liberation struggle. The Dutch not only stood up, they broke free. The northern Netherlands successfully threw off Spanish and inquisitorial rule, establishing a republic that became a haven for religious refugees, including those escaping the Inquisitions of other lands. Thus, the Spanish Inquisition inadvertently spurred the creation of one of Europe's first bastions of religious toleration, the exact opposite of what they wanted, I suppose. Well, this grand historical turn shows a bit of a paradox of repression. The more fiercely the Inquisition tried to stamp out heresy, the more unified and determined the resistance became, ultimately, with time winning against the odds. I often think, I wonder what those inquisitors would think about our modern world. Good Lord. Well, within Spain itself, by the 18th century, the once dreaded tribunal was facing increasing criticism and pushback from enlightened Spaniards. Figures such as Friar Luis de Leon, a renowned 16th century scholar, had earlier hinted that defiance by maintaining his innocence and serenity during years of Inquisition in the cell, he famously resumed teaching with, "as we were saying yesterday upon release," as if the Inquisition had not broken him. By the 18th century, even some within the church and government viewed the Inquisition as an embarrassment. In 1770, the reformist monarch Charles III and his ministers curtailed the Inquisition's independence. They banned the worst torture practices and censored the censor, prohibiting the Inquisition from banning certain scientific and philosophical works that the Crown actually wanted to encourage. Finally, during the Napoleonic occupation and subsequent liberal revolts, the Spanish Inquisition was suspended and permanently abolished in 1834. Crowds in 19th century Spain reportedly celebrated the end of the tribunal, sometimes storming Inquisition buildings and liberating the last prisoners. It took centuries, but the accumulated effect of all those who had stood up, through writings, revolt, and through martyrdom, helped delegitimize the Inquisition. By the time of its abolition, even many clergy agreed with the statesman Juan Antonio Llorente, a former inquisitorial secretary turned historian, that the Inquisition had been a grievous error. In Lorenzo's scathing account, published in 1817, after he fled to France, he exposed the secret archives and excesses of the Spanish Inquisition, effectively turning its own record into an indictment of the system. Thus, the pen of a disillusioned insider became the final act of defiance, dismantling the Inquisition's mystique with cold fact. Well, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We still need to talk about the intellectuals in earlier times. So let's go back to Italy during the Roman Inquisition, established in 1542. Well, that took a name at theologians, scientists, free thinkers, anyone's ideas who challenged the Catholic doctrine. Some of the most famous run-ins between individuals in the Inquisition are occurring in this period. These were the battles of intellect and principle, often fought in written arguments and inquisitorial hearings. Consider one case, an especially tragic one of Giordano Bruno, a brilliant and erratic philosopher-monk. Bruno had wandered through Europe for many years, promulgating daring ideas, an infinite universe with innumerable worlds, a cosmic divinity present in all things, and various unorthodox theological views. The Roman Inquisition eventually caught him and hauled him before its tribunal. For 7 grueling years he was interrogated and pressured to recount his teachings, but he stood firm. He refused to renounce his philosophy, even as the noose tightened. On February the 8th, 1800, the Inquisition condemned him as an impenitent heretic and handed him over to secular authorities for execution. At the pronouncement of his death sentence, he delivered a quite legendary retort, turning to his judges and calmly saying, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence with greater fear than I receive it." Those chilling words, reported by a witness, show Bruno's defiance at the final moment. He suggested that the inquisitors were more fearful in condemning him than he was in accepting his own martyrdom. After this last act of rebellion, Bruno was led to Campo de Fioro in Rome. The Inquisition, in a final indignity, had his tongue gagged to prevent any further speech. And then they burned him alive. Bruno's steadfastness, refusing to abjure even under threat of the stake, made him a martyr for freedom of thought in the eyes of the later generations. At the time, it was a stark warning that the Roman Inquisition would show no mercy to those who persisted in unorthodox beliefs. But Bruno's death also became one of the black marks that gradually undermined the moral authority of the Inquisition. But no account of intellectual resistance to the Inquisition is complete without Galileo Galilei, the astronomer whose name is virtually synonymous with the clash between science and church. Well, Galileo's story is a little more nuanced, for he initially tried to work within the system. In 1610, he publicized his telescope discoveries supporting Copernicus's sun-centered astronomy. The idea of the Earth orbiting the sun was controversial and evidently deemed vehement suspect of heresy. Well, Galileo did not openly defy the 1616 decree. Instead, he bided his time. But as an intellectual, he was internally standing up for truth. He wrote a masterful treatise, The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems, in 1632, which defended heliocentrism, indirectly through a clever fictional debate. This was Galileo's way of challenging the Inquisition's ban without overtly breaking it, a calculated, brave gambit to advance science. The Roman Inquisition, however, saw through the ruse. Galileo was summoned to Rome and put on trial in 1633. At nearly 70 years old, threatened with torture, Galileo capitulated outwardly. He kneeled and recanted the Copernican doctrine, declaring he abjured, cursed, and detested the idea of a moving earth. According to popular legend, after rising from his knees, he muttered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, indicating his true belief that the earth does move indeed. Whether or not he actually said those words, the story is apocryphal, but they encapsulate the reality that Galileo's submission was only skin deep. He indeed obeyed the Inquisition's order and lived, spending his remaining years under house arrest, but his scientific findings could not be undone by a forced recantation. His writings were copied and smuggled abroad to the Protestant North, beyond the Inquisition's reach, where they influenced other thinkers. In effect, Galileo found a way to stand up to the Inquisition's censorship by ensuring that his ideas survived. Though he did not embrace martyrdom like Bruno, Galileo's fate, humiliation instead of execution, still showed the heavy hand of the Inquisition against intellectual freedom. It also demonstrated the different forms of resistance that can be taken. For Galileo, quiet persistence and dissemination of truth, even while formally bowing to authority, was a form of defiance that paid off in the long run. By the 18th century, the Church itself tacitly admitted Galileo had been right about the cosmos, rescinding the ban on heliocentric books. His saga remains a pretty classic example of an individual challenging orthodoxy, and through a mix of courage and pragmatism ultimately prevailing, scientifically perhaps, if not personally. Other scholars and philosophers subjected to the Roman Inquisition likewise resisted in their own ways. Tommaso Campanella, a Dominican friar in Italy, was imprisoned for 27 years for heresy and sedition. He reportedly faked insanity under torture to avoid execution, a psychological form of resistance that perhaps saved his life. Despite his incarceration, Campanella continued to write daring works, like the utopian work City of the Sun. Inquisitors could lock up his body, but not quench his intellect. Eventually he was released and even championed by the Pope, a rare, happy turnabout. Another case, Paolo Sarpi, a Venetian scholar and statesman, took on the Inquisition not in a trial but print. In Venice, the Inquisition's influence was curtailed by the proud Republic. Sarpi defended Venice's rights against papal interference and wrote scathing critiques of church policies, including a history of church councils that challenged papal supremacy. Rome, of course, viewed Sarpi as an enemy. An assassination attempt left him scarred by knife wounds, and as he recovered, Sarpi famously quipped, "Agnosco stylum curiae." I recognized the stylus of the Roman curia, comparing the dagger strokes to pen strokes of a papal edict. Sarpi survived and kept writing. His life shows a subtle battle, a Catholic cleric using reason and law to fight the Inquisition's reach, embodying the incipient Enlightenment skepticism within a Catholic context. Meanwhile, in the wider world of print, the Roman Inquisition's index of forbidden books was another arena of resistance. Authors and printers stood up by circulating banned books in secret. This passive cultural resistance sapped the Inquisition's effectiveness over time. Each prohibited book smuggled under the nose of the Inquisition was a quiet victory for intellectual freedom. And by the 18th century, even high-ranking churchmen and royals were reading banned, French philosophical works, rendering the index something of a paper tiger. Knowledge ultimately outmaneuvered repression, a testament to the countless unnamed individuals who risked penalties to possess or distribute a heretical book. Every secret personal library of contraband literature was a small little act of rebellion that collectively weakened the control over thought. Well, let's turn our attention away from the Spanish Inquisition in our next section, and we can talk about the Portuguese Inquisition. They don't talk about that one too often, but it's quite interesting. It was established in 1536. It paralleled Spain's Inquisition, but of course it had its own theatres of operation, including the overseas colonies in Brazil, Africa, and Asia, notably Goa in India. But just as in Spain, many victims were new Christians or converted Jews, and they too found ways to resist or escape. A prominent pattern of resistance here was simply running away, a tried and tested strategy. Whole families of Conversos fled to Portugal, to places where the Inquisition had no power. For instance, Uriel de Costa, born into a Converso family, decided to revert openly to Judaism. Rather than await punishment in Portugal, he fled to Amsterdam in the Dutch Republic, where he could live pretty much unharmed. Uriel de Costa's story took a tragic turn. He clashed with the Jewish community's doctrines and felt caught between two inquisitions, the Catholic and a figurative rabbinic one, thrown to the wolves by what he thought were his own people. But the fact remains that many people like him voted with their feet, depriving the Inquisition of its prey. By escaping to more tolerant regions, perhaps Ottoman Turkey, or the Netherlands, some parts of Italy, these Conversos denied the Inquisition their conviction. This was resistance through self-removal. They created flourishing ex-Converso communities abroad, from which they sometimes spoke out against inquisitorial Spain and Portugal. Some published polemics describing persecution of Jews in Iberia, adding to the growing chorus of criticism from Protestant and enlightened Catholics alike. But not everyone could flee. Some chose to fight from within. One of the most remarkable opponents of the Portuguese Inquisition was Father Antonio Vieira, a 17th century Jesuit priest. Vieira was a celebrated preacher and a confidant of King John IV. He became an outspoken critic of the Inquisition's harsh treatment of the new Christians, and argued that persecuting valuable citizens was morally wrong, and further to that, economically foolish. He used the pulpit and court influence to advocate for the Conversos, urging the king to implement reforms. But the Inquisition struck back. In 1663 they arrested and charged Vieira with heretical propositions, partly for his slightly mystical writings, but underlyingly for his challenge to their authority. Vieira didn't take it lying down. He defended himself vigorously during the trial, producing learned arguments and refusing to confess to any wrongdoing. After years of detention, he managed to secure release. Pressure from the royal court, and even the Pope, helped resolve the case in his favor. Though silenced for a time, Vieira eventually saw a kind of victory. By 1773, about a century after his efforts began, Portugal granted a general pardon to descendants of new Christians, as the Inquisition's power continued to wane. Vieira's confrontation with the Holy Office demonstrated an insider's resistance, a devout Catholic fighting the excesses of the system, using persuasion and legal defense. His survival and rehabilitation were unusual. It showed that by the 17th century, The Inquisition could not so easily destroy a man esteemed for his eloquence and royal allies. I suppose, in a sense, Vieira beat them at their own game, navigating the Church's hierarchy to outlast his pursuers. But what about out in the colonies? Well, in the New World, the Inquisition often faced logistical limits and cultural challenges. In Spanish America and Portuguese India, standing up to the Inquisition took unique forms. For indigenous people newly Christianized, resistance sometimes meant persisting in their ancestral beliefs and sacred rites, despite the risk of punishment. In Peru, for example, native Andeans continued covert worship of their traditional gods, while outwardly attending Mass, a quiet, everyday defiance of the inquisitors who sought to extirpate idolatry. Occasionally, it flared into open revolt. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in New Mexico against Spanish rule was partly provoked by suppression of indigenous religion. The Pueblo leaders targeted missionaries, though technically the Spanish Inquisition itself did not operate in New Mexico. The spirit of resistance to forced Catholicism was akin to resisting an Inquisition. In Goa, the center of the Portuguese Inquisition in Asia, Hindu and Muslim communities suffered demands to abandon their customs. Many Brahmins and traders simply left Goa for neighboring Indian states when the pressure became too great, thereby undermining the colony's prosperity, a form of economic resistance that made even some colonial officials question the Inquisition's zeal. Within Goa, some Christian converts defied the Inquisition by continuing to observe caste rules and Hindu festivals quietly. One striking colonial case of individual defiance is that of Luis de Carvajal the Younger, a new Christian in 16th century Mexico. Carvajal was a secret Jew who, along with his family, secretly practiced Judaism under the very nose of the Mexican Inquisition. When arrested, Louis initially feigned repentance and was released, but he couldn't resist continuing to observe his forbidden faith. Rearrested and imprisoned, he managed to write a clandestine memoir in jail, signing it with his Jewish name, Joseph Lombroso, and exhorting his remaining family to keep the faith. Even as the Inquisition prepared to execute him, Carvajal found solace in asserting his true identity on paper. In 1596 he was burned at the stake in Mexico City, along with several other family members, all refusing to recant their Judaism. Their ashes mingled with those of others, but their words and steadfastness lived on to inspire later Conversos. Meanwhile, the Inquisition in the New World sometimes clashed with colonial authorities who had different priorities. For example, in the 17th century, the Mexican Inquisition pursued an Irish man named William Lamport, who had plotted an uprising against Spanish rule. Lamport was not your typical heretic. He was charged with sedition and also practicing astrology and reading forbidden books. The Inquisition kept him jailed for years. In 1650, Lamport daringly escaped from his cell one Christmas Eve, and instead of fleeing the country, he took to the streets of Mexico to paste up manifestos in the city denouncing the Inquisition and proclaiming a new order of liberty. A pretty bold move, effectively a one-man protest in the Capitol Plaza. It didn't last too long. He was quickly recaptured, and his audacious broadsides earned him a death sentence. At his auto de fe in 1659, legend says that he managed to strangle himself on the stake with ropes, or was perhaps mercifully strangled by a friend so that he died before the flames consumed him. To the Mexican populace, he became a folk hero, later embellished into the figure of El Zorro in popular myth. William Lamport's story is remarkable because he directly attacked the Inquisition in print and attempted to incite the public. Though he perished, the rebellious proclamations calling out the inquisitors by name and accusing them of tyranny were a clarion call that echoed throughout New Spain. And so, by the 18th and 19th centuries, the once all-powerful Inquisitions were well and truly in decline, thanks in no small part to the cumulative effort of the people standing up to them over generations. The Enlightenment brought out a philosophical onslaught against the idea of persecution for belief. Writers like Voltaire relished condemning the Inquisition. His novel, Candide, savagely satirized a Portuguese auto de fe. In Catholic countries, enlightened monarchs took measures to curb or abolish the tribunals. Emperor Joseph II in Habsburg lands, for instance, prohibited the Inquisition in Lombardy and other territories that he controlled. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany, under Leopold II, outright abolished torture and the death penalty for heresy, effectively nullifying the Inquisition there. In 1774, the Pope himself suppressed the Jesuit-run Inquisition in the Duchy of Parma after the enlightened duchy expelled the inquisitors. In Portugal, the powerful minister, Marques de Pombal, expelled the Jesuits and reformed the Inquisition drastically after 1755, even staging a public auto de fe in 1761, not to punish heretics, but to disgrace the Inquisition itself for a miscarriage of justice. Pombal then banned autos de fe entirely in 1774. These top-down actions were essentially political figures standing up to the Inquisition in the name of modernity and state power. The Italian rulers who curtailed the Inquisition did so not purely from humanitarian toleration, but to assert the supremacy of secular law over church courts. Nonetheless, their actions aligned with goals long sought by critics to end the terror of the inquisitorial persecution. And finally, events came full circle in Spain in 1820. After a brief suppression during the Napoleonic era, the Inquisition was re-established by Ferdinand VII. But Spanish liberals, inspired by constitutional ideas, rose up in revolution. In Madrid, a populous crowd in 1820 stormed the Inquisition's building. According to eyewitness accounts, they freed the remaining prisoners and symbolically burned the Inquisition's records and furniture, as if they were exorcising a demon. Though this was a short-lived episode, the Inquisition was reinstated again before being permanently abolished in 1834. It was a dramatic popular repudiation of the Holy Office. By the time Queen Isabella II signed the decree of final abolition in 1834, the Inquisition was a moribund relic, widely seen as incompatible with this new age of liberty. Looking back, one can trace a direct line from the lonely heretic facing his judges to the throngs of citizens dismantling the Inquisition's edifice. Each individual who stood up, whether by a witty retort or steadfast silent under torture, a secret book or even an armed rebellion, all of them had contributed a brick to the eventual edifice of religious toleration and freedom of thought. As the enlightened former Inquisitor Sebastian Castellio wrote in the 16th century, condemning the execution of heretics, to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but to kill a man we do not prove our faith by burning a person, but by dying for that faith. Words penned in the shadow of the Inquisition, resonating as a moral verdict on the entire enterprise of persecution. In the end, They could not extinguish all their opponents. Truth, dignity, and human conscience proved to be much more resilient. Many who defied the Inquisition perished, but in their very defeat they often triumphed in the long run, as Montaigne suggested, by inspiring others and exposing injustice. And that's the end of our time together today, unless you feel like watching another video, which I'm sure that's all up to you. Well, I'd like to thank the top-tier patrons who keep everything ad-free, keep everything running. And it's Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfitnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Gugu Bubonic. Thank you so much. And yes, as I said, that's it from me today. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, everyone, have a good think about what we learned together today. What did you take away from it? Certainly quite a risk to stand up to the Inquisition. A lot at stake. At stake. Maybe we shouldn't use the word stake. Anyway, as always, lots of love to you all. Good night. See you next time.